Thanks for the introduction. So, probably a lot of you have felt like I have at various times in life, wish that there was a script that you could refer to know exactly how to respond in a given situation, whether it's your personal life or at work. You get in a tough situation, you kind of like maybe sneak a look in the script and see exactly which way to go with whatever decision it is or twist in your life. But unfortunately, there is no script, and and if there was, we'd probably all want it to say happily ever after at the end. But again, these things only happen in fairy tales. So the reality is we're all left in a world where we're largely making it up as we go along, and basically improvising. Recently, I've come to a pretty firm conclusion that improvisation, the ability to improvise, is a pretty key skill that allows you to succeed or fail. The better you are at it, the more likely you are to succeed, and the worse you are, the more likely you are to fail. And this is true for individuals and companies. The theme keeps popping up in unexpected places. For example, this weekend I was out with the Boy Scouts and watching my son improvise with flotation devices using their clothes to survive for a merit badge test. A couple of weeks ago I was preparing for table topics, which is obviously good practice for at least verbal improvisation, as opposed to the kind of improvisation that MacGyver or Survivor Man does. So we were talking, as I tested some of the questions on some of the employees at Sunview, trying to also encourage them to come with me. Unfortunately, they weren't convinced, to participate in Toastmasters. But as I talked, we got on a side conversation about all the improvisation that's happened getting the company off the ground. For example, hiring, it's probably not a surprise to anybody here. It's difficult to hire people when you don't have any revenue and you don't have any benefits. I don't know how many people here would be willing to go to work for a company with no benefits.
Oh, wait, shut up.
Occasionally you find a few. But obviously, we improvised. We, for example, hired a guy who wanted to be a priest to come in and be our first QA and support person. And he's now off doing just that. He's a couple years into his, I guess they call it seminary, I don't know.
Yep.
But he did a really good job for us. But there's a lot of examples like that, even in terms of selling the first version of the product. People don't buy enterprise software from people that have never sold enterprise software.
That's right.
Funny thing, so we improvised. We found some colleagues, friends that were IT managers, convinced them to use the software and use them as references when we found real customers. So lots of examples of this keep coming up. One thing that occurred to me on the way over, I was thinking about a quote I saw recently on Twitter that somewhat relates to our bird of the day. So Thomas Edison, probably not everybody knows, but he helped perfect the dynamo, which is the other sense of the word. He was a dynamo in terms of generating inventions himself, and clearly understood improvisation. I mean, there's a case where supposedly a new employee asked him what the rules are in the laboratory, and he said, we have no rules here, we're trying to get something done. So again, just an example of the fewer the rules, the more you're allowed to improvise, maybe the more you can get accomplished. And especially in today's world where technology is changing at such a rapid pace, and there's global competition in every industry nowadays. So many more players competing for whatever area it is to be successful in. So you start to see a pattern here, and again, the idea just keeps popping up. So I was reading a book recently called The Upside of Turbulence. And I'll show you somehow I feel compelled when I talk about a book to show the cover, but no longer read paper books, but this is what the cover looks like. The author, Don Soul, talks a great deal, very specifically, about this topic. And I didn't expect to find it in the book. It was already on my mind. But he talks and he uses an example of improv theater, for example, in talking about how, for example, when those actors start out, they don't know where the skit is going, just like in many cases, developing software or starting a company, you really don't know necessarily where you're headed. You might have a destination in mind, just as the actors in that skit have a destination. They want to entertain the audience. But it's along the way, taking that feedback incrementally from the audience and following a few basic rules. Ultimately, they achieve their goal and they entertain people. And he makes a very good use of this analogy in the book that I don't have time to delve much deeper into, and so I'd encourage you to read the book. But he also uses another example about one of the early jet fighters that the Americans had in the Korean War, and they thought going into the war that this airplane was going to lose 10-1 to the Soviet plane, but in the end it was the other way around. Initially they thought it was due to the pilots on the U.S. side being, superior. Naturally, we might think that. But after some analysis, it turned out that it was really due to the ability of those pilots to do more improvisational sorts of moves with the airplane. Despite the fact that the MiG had much better performance statistics overall, the fact that they could make non-routine movements with the plane gave them an advantage that nobody understood or expected until a couple of years. It took years even for them to do the analysis and realize it. So the point being that ability to improvise made a huge difference that nobody understood, and can make that same kind of difference as we undertake whatever our various job roles are, and or even in our daily life in some cases. So yet another book that I've been reading lately talks more about exactly the same subject. It's called The Click Moment. It's a pretty new book that's come out recently. The author's name is Franz Johansson. And in this book, he makes the case that success isn't as scripted as most people tend to believe it is. And for myself personally, I know hearing Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoonist, talk about this, that I saw a keynote speech. He did a really good job. Everybody laughed the whole time. So if you ever get a chance to see him speak, you should. Unfortunately, I don't think he's speaking that much anymore because he was having trouble talking. So he didn't even know why, but serious problem. But nevertheless, he made the case that his success all turned on a rather serendipitous encounter that he had, and he probably would have still been working for the large corporation. It was, I think, Pacific Gas was who he was employed with. But so being open to this somewhat improvisational turn and veering off in that direction as opposed to where else he might have gone is what he attributed to his success. It wasn't that he thought and planned and it wasn't scripted by any means. So by being open to improvisation or to a twist and going off script, he was ultimately successful, whereas he might not have been otherwise. And the book also talks a lot about how certain areas, there's rules that are so fixed that you can rise to the top just by following a formula or a script. For example, most people probably know that Tiger Woods' father raised him to be a golf star, and the same with the Williams sisters being tennis stars. Because the rules don't change from the time that you're young until you're able to compete internationally, you can raise someone to compete at that level and win. But in other areas, it's not the case. In business today, it's absolutely not the case. For example, Nokia, who recently, over the last couple of years, completely lost their domination in the cell phone industry to Apple and later to Google. The rules changed, and Apple took advantage of it. Nokia tried to stay on script. They thought they were the ones that could write the script, but it turns out that wasn't true. And he makes a great example of how Lance Armstrong could not beat Serena Williams in tennis. It's just not going to happen. Right? But meanwhile, Apple, being like, in this case, the Lance Armstrong, who's never done cell phones, was able to beat Nokia easily and soundly because the rules changed. So in other words, improvisation, you can't pretend there's a script. You can't keep going down that same path. You have to be ready to veer off and take twists and turns and go off script. So, just to restate my point in conclusion, improvisation is clearly, to me, based on my own experience with some of you and reading books, becoming a very key skill when it comes to being successful in today's world. Thank you.